All right. Well, welcome back to I'll Read It Eventually. Today I'm going to be talking about this book, The Lost Mountain, A Year in the Vanishing Wilderness, Radical Strip Mining, and the Devastation of Appalachia, which is a really long title. Didn't really think about that until now. It's an excellent book. One of the things I like most about it is actually that it is a book about Kentucky, written by a Kentuckian. Um, Now, it is a little dated. When I started reading it, I was not entirely clear on when it was written, um, but then he dates each part of the book, and so it very quickly became apparent that this was relatively old, um, 20 years old. Um, so, not directly applicable today, because as we'll talk about, what is going on or what is described in this book is not something that's still going on in the same way that he discusses it in this book. Um, but definitely applicable for us now. So written in 2006, it's by a guy named Erik Reece. His pictures in the back here. Let's see if I can find it in a timely fashion. Oh yeah, there he is. I don't know why that helps you, but that's what he looks like. Um, so this is a really good book. I really enjoyed this book. Probably 4 out of 5. Sometime I'll have to explain how I rate books. But it's 4 out of 5. It's a very good book. I would recommend it to anybody who finds themselves interested by what I'm about to talk about. And he, in this book, details the destruction via strip mining of this mountain on the cover, which is in Appalachia. I believe it's in Martin County, Kentucky. I think that's right. It's in far eastern Kentucky, middle of nowhere, eastern Kentucky. And it is called Lost Mountain. So but it's a little bit of an ironic piece for the book because the book is about strip mining generally, but then how it specifically affects this particular place. So there's a bit of a journey going on because he's talking to people from all across Appalachia who have lived in communities where strip mining has taken place. He's talking to people who are active in trying to stop strip mining. He's talking to people who are talking about or researching the effects that it has. So it's very wide ranging, but then he goes once a month to this particular mountain and describes what's taken place in the process of strip mining. So, um, yeah, very interesting book, especially if you're not particularly familiar with strip mining, which I was. I was probably about like 30% of like what goes on I knew, and the rest of this was a bit of a learning experience. So, assuming that you're like me, this is basically what strip mining is. This is the process. You, after doing a geological survey to figure out where the coal is, because strip mining is done for coal primarily, once you figured out that there's coal under a particular mountain, you will go get your permit to mine there, and then you will clear cut the area, which means you cut down all the trees. You clear away the brush with bulldozers. Typically, what will happen is those trees are either pushed into a valley or they're burned, or sometimes both. But you'll shove them off the side of the mountain so that they're out of the way. And then you drill a series of holes and you put in a compound called ANFO, which is an acronym for ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, which is highly explosive. And then you blow away the mountain piece by piece. Um, Coal is in seams, which basically means there's layers of earth, and some of those layers are composed entirely of coal or mostly of coal, and so you'll blast your way down to a seam, um, and you'll shelve the mountain away. So you literally stair step it so that you can work, right? You'll flatten it out with bulldozers so that you can harvest the coal out of a seam. And once you've harvested it out, or once you've dug in far enough, you'll drill some more holes up above and you'll blast out that part of the mountain. And then you'll cart this coal away once you've cleaned it off, truck it away along roads. And as you blow away more and more of the mountain, you take the debris and you put it in trucks, and these are running basically all the time because there's a whole mountain to move. And that material, which is called overburden, the overburden is scooped up, put in the backs of big dump trucks, and then it's dumped into nearby valleys. Um, presumably, supposedly, so that it can then be moved back later, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it's typically dumped just into a nearby valley. And in theory, once you have harvested all the coal from a seam, you repeat that process all the way down to, they're usually between I think it's 4 and 6 seams of coal that most strip mining is attempting to get to in Appalachia. And so once you've gotten to whatever proportion of the coal you're trying to get to in a particular mountain, um, the process that has been established by law is that the land is then reclaimed. And one aspect of that is roughly restoring the contour of the mountain as it existed when you got there, which means you would take all that dirt and all that rock and all that other stuff and you would pile it back up roughly in the shape and size that it was before you got there, in theory. Now, this book it's very much an environmentalist book. Okay, so Erik Reece is very much against strip mining. I find myself being very much against strip mining specifically, maybe not so much against mining as a general rule, but strip mining specifically. And so this book is about the issues, all the bad things, right? This is one half of a debate. Okay, so it's really important when you're hearing me talk about it, and just for my own sake, really important you understand, like, this is not the whole picture, but this is him saying, hey, this is what this does, or these are the effects that we see from strip mining. So just know this is half the debate. I have not read on the other side of this the account of a guy who works at a strip mine or the account of a guy who owns a strip mining company and is like, hey, here's all the good things this does. I will mention some things, but this is very much one side of this, which is, hey, this is really bad, we should stop it. Ultimately, I think that lands in the right place. I think that's correct. I think it's really bad, and I don't think we should do strip mining in this particular way, really, for almost any reason. But that is only half the discussion. So, the issues that he outlines with strip mining, and again, this is the whole book. He tells it in a very narrative way. I'm just going to, quick as I can, just sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, punch through these. These are the issues he identifies. Number one, kind of going in the same structure of how do you do strip mining? Well, when you clear cut an entire mountain, and really, ultimately, because it's a coal seam and it's running through the ground, you're going from mountain to mountain to mountain to mountain, and they're next to each other, or adjacent to each other, very close to each other. Which means you're not just clear cutting one mountain in a particular area, you're clear cutting that mountain, and then you're clear cutting the mountain next door, and the mountain next door, and the mountain next door. I was talking to my dad about this earlier, and he showed me a map. It's Kentucky government website. Office of Surface Mining, I think. Office of Surface Mining website. And there's a map of Martin County, Kentucky, and it has on it all of the mines with a site map. So it shows you all the land that is mined. And it's just whole ridgelines, 20, 30-mile long strips, which is why it's called strip mining in part, where every raised piece of ground has been strip mined and blown away in order to get to the coal beneath. Okay, so it's not just one isolated place, it's multiple contiguous or adjacent places. My dog's having a dream. So. It's okay, Charlie. So when you go and clear cut, a 30-mile stretch of wilderness that's 1.5 miles, 2 miles wide, that's really destructive of an ecosystem. And if you do that all across a county or multiple contiguous counties, which is what happens or happened in Appalachia in eastern Kentucky, that's really destructive, first of all, for trees, right? There are 80 species of trees in Appalachia and Kentucky. When you start clear cutting them, you can really harm those populations. Kind of hard. When you think of a forest, you don't think that humans can cut enough, right, for it to be a big deal. But you can clear cut entire forests, and you can certainly cut enough of a population that it becomes a problem for the survival of that population, right? And if you cut too many old trees, the whole forest suffers, which is a whole other. Need to read a whole other book to talk about that, but that's a thing. If you cut too many old trees, the rest of the forest is going to suffer. It's also bad for the animals that live there, right? So he starts off the book by talking about trying to find a cerulean warbler, which is this really tiny bird. really small. It's blue, as the name suggests, cerulean. But it requires a very specific type of forested area. You have to have essentially about 40 square miles of uninterrupted forest land. Well, in Appalachia, you can't find that in a lot of places, which means that the breeding grounds for this particular bird, the amount of it that is out there is shrinking, right? And this is still a problem. The cerulean warbler is actually still very much an endangered species. I know that because I like birds a lot, and I've never seen one because they're endangered because they can't breed in the way that they used to. So the population is just fallen off a cliff, and still I think is actually, I don't know if it's stable, but it's small. It's very small. We're talking like something like 5,000 breeding pairs in the wild or something like that. I mean, somewhere around 12 to 14,000 birds. That's small. There's also flying squirrels in Kentucky, which live in this type of area in Appalachia, and you cut down all the trees. They don't have anything to glide from, you know. And there are other creatures as well, right? And even if they're not endangered, it's still habitat loss starts in a particular place. And you might be like, well, there's still 98% of their habitat. Well, yeah, but if you want to clear cut another 50% of their habitat, well, there's only going to be 50% of their habitat left. So it matters, right? Even if you're starting out and it's like, oh well, wild turkeys are fine. Well, yeah, unless you cut away all the rest of their habitat. So it can become a problem even for species that you think of as healthy, right? Um, Secondly, when you're blowing away parts of a mountain, that causes flying debris. There are regulations about how much info you can use in a particular blast site, how close other things are. What he says in the book, and I have no way of knowing if this is true, but I don't think he would have published it if it were an outright lie. What he says in the book is because regulators are rarely on site, miners will often pack a hole without knowing exactly how much explosive is in there, kind of eyeball it. Having made things myself out of wood and things like that, the tendency to eyeball is very great. So I feel that if you work at a strip mine and you're like constantly packing things with explosives, you probably reach a point where you're like, yeah, that's about enough, and you don't use the measuring cup because it takes too long, right? You're like, yeah, a little bit more, right? Sometimes it's not enough, sometimes it's too much. That causes flying debris. He talks about a story where these people were sitting in their backyard. They have an in-ground pool, and there's an explosion at the mine, and flying debris comes and like lands in their swimming pool, and they're like, four grandchildren are in the swimming pool. There's like rocks the size of their heads like, splashing down into the pool because they've come sailing from a mile away because there's been a fuel oil explosion. So that's a real danger, right? The explosions are so powerful and so repetitive that they regularly crack people's foundations and cause other issues with buildings in the area. So, like, your house could start to fall apart because you live too close to a mine. Um, when the coal is being carted away, it's put into really big trucks. Um, those trucks driving on really small country roads, very hard on the roads, not nice to drive with, he says. I've never driven around a coal truck, but I imagine a giant dump truck filled with coal, and they're trying to move as much coal as they can as quickly as they can. Probably not sharing the road particularly well. But something like that is also really hard on the infrastructure, right? He talks about one place where there were signs at the bridges that said, hey, there's a 40-ton limit on these bridges. And then a mountain in the area was strip mined, and those signs just disappeared. And there were trucks going across that clearly had more than 40 tons of coal in them, never mind how much the truck itself weighed, right? He talks about the fact in Knott County, Kentucky, that's spelled with a K, um, that there was a road that was rated for, I think it was 50 tons, and there were coal trucks that were like regulators checked, and they were carrying on average 70 tons. With some carrying closer to 100 tons. And again, that's not even including the truck itself, which is going to weigh a couple tons because it's a dump truck. So, a big dump truck. So, um, really hard in the infrastructure, and then coal companies don't pay to fix the roads, right? And they don't pay to improve the roads. They just strip mine the mountain and then they move along, right? And oh, the road's bad. It's a problem for somebody else to fix, right? Um, so Not great. Also, coal makes dust. Coal dust is bad for you. It causes a disease called black lung. My great grandfather had black lung. I think it's what killed him. Pretty sure. He worked in an underground coal mine, which is also dangerous. But yeah, not good. Um, so coal dust can, if you have regular movement of trucks through a community, coal dust will come off of those trucks and blanket people's houses, their yards. There's a guy in the book, he says, I can't sit on my front porch because everything's blanketed in coal dust, including me, if I sit out there. Um, they said, he writes at one point, there's a guy, several people in this particular community he's in, they can dust their house every morning, and by evening they need to dust it again because of the coal dust, right? That's filtering in even through, from outside into their houses. Um, and then if you're strip mining a mountain, you have to dump all the overburden or fill material, and all that stuff gets dumped into valleys. Well, valleys in Appalachia exist because they're natural water runoff points. The water falls on the mountains and it runs off the sides, and that's where those valleys came from. They're products of erosion. So when you fill them in, you do one of two things. You either cover up the water courses, which is bad for the watershed, or you dump a bunch of stuff into it, which was not previously in it because it was held within the ground, right? Deep underground, sometimes, stuck inside rocks or in between rocks. So it's not leaching into the water. And so when you're dumping hundreds of tons of dirt and rock into a water course, it either destroys the water course or it causes the things which were before stuck inside the ground and not in the water. It pushes them all into the water. And we're not just talking about dirt. Obviously, that's a problem, of course. But you have a process called sedimentation, right, where the dirt gets into the water and causes problems in the water. But it's also the chemicals and minerals and compounds that were held within it that are now in the water. Things like cadmium and bromine, which are poisonous, right? And then there's also a compound that they use to clean coal on the site. It's like a liquid. And that, obviously, there's a huge amount of that that's being poured down into these fill areas. And that's a known carcinogen, right? And that's going into, in many cases, going into the water. And so there is a very well-known um, bright orange color to mine runoff. And if you live in one of these communities, you could look at it and be like, oh yeah, that's getting in the water and you can't drink that water anymore because that's mine runoff. It's acidic. And so we're talking about hundreds or in some cases even thousands of times the allowable level of toxic chemicals in the water in these communities. You can't drink the water. You can't even bathe in the water, right? You have to buy bottled water to give your children a bath, that kind of thing. Okay. Coal slurry, which is what they call the liquid clean off leftovers, and the sedimentation, right? All of that poured into a valley that can cause mudslides, that can cause floods or make flooding more likely. There's a town he talks about in the book that experienced 300-year floods in the same 2-week span because he says because they live near a strip mine, which was not following regulations regarding this fill material. And there are regulations. A lot of the things he points out in this book, the regulations say X, but the companies aren't regulated well, so they do Y and Z, and nobody ever slaps them on the wrist for it. Or they get slapped on the wrist, but the slap on the wrist is, $15,000 fine, and these companies, make over $4 billion a year, so they're just going to take the fine and move on. And in many cases, they appeal the fine to get it, brought even lower. And so it's just, these they destroy watersheds. Okay, coal mines like this destroy watersheds, or can. I'm sure there are some that don't, but they can destroy watersheds. And then finally, once you finish mining a mountain in this way, you're supposed to do reclamation. And reclamation, as Erik Reece talks about in this book, reclamation is a joke. I think he said something like 80% of mine lands are not ever reclaimed. And this is in 2006. So again, this has changed. I'm going to talk about that in a couple minutes. This has changed. But at the time of him writing this book, like 80% of mine lands were not reclaimed in any meaningful sense. Um, reclamation, again, is you take the dirt and you pile it back up in the rough shape of a mountain. Well, number one, that doesn't really work unless you're compacting it, because it was made that way naturally over time. You can't just build a mountain and have it be structurally sound. And so a lot of coal companies, both to avoid building something which might fall over and also to avoid the time and expense of moving all the dirt twice, they will ask for a variance on the contour, right? A contour variance, so that they don't have to go back and rebuild the mountain. And in the book, again, this is in 2006, but in the book, an official from the Department of the Interior for the United States says essentially anyone who asks for a contour variance is going to get one, because it's just the way the game is played, right? They just give them to everybody. Which means most mountains don't go back into mountains. They look like that. Flat, right? And they stay that way, right? Just a flat piece of land. Now, often they're going to be planted with like a grass, quick growing grass. Quick growing grass. Wow, try and say that 10 times fast. Quick growing grass. But that's nothing like the ecosystem that was there before. There's no trees. The animals that live there don't live there anymore. They're not introducing animals, and they're not introducing, a complex biome of any kind. It's just, hey, we're going to plant some fescue, and that's it. And that's all they're required to do, is the thing. You can do that, and that is, according to most regulators, that is enough, right? You flatten out the mountain, you plant some sod, and you're like, okay, cool, on to the next one. And the regulators, the U.S. government, will say, great job. And that's all it takes. That's a problem, right? Forests and mountains take, and this depends on how you think about geological time, but something that took at the least a couple hundred years to make, but at the, long range took millions of years to make. You're destroying in a matter of seconds, minutes, hours, days, maybe a year, right? This book covers a year. So you're blowing up a mountain that took millions of years to form into that shape and in that way. You're destroying forests that, at this point, they're 200-year-old forests, right? The Appalachians were almost clear cut in 1800s. And so the forests we have now are like 200 years old. You're just clear cutting that, right? Well, you can't get that back tomorrow, even if you planted trees and the kind of trees that were there, and then as many trees as were there. You're not getting it back, right? That's problematic, because it changes the ecosystem, and in many cases, it makes it unlivable for certain types of animals that lived there before. It doesn't fix the problems with the water that you created. It doesn't necessarily fix the problem with landslides and mudslides. So it leaves a lot to be desired. Now, a lot of companies are going to say, hey, Appalachia's really hilly. We've created a flat spot. Look, prime development land. And one of the things, because I talked to my dad about this, one of the things that my dad told me is actually that is very common now, to take those flattened areas and say, all right, let's put a subdivision here, right? Let's build some affordable housing. Let's put a subdivision here. And that'll be, a boon for the place that before was a very, very poor place. Okay. So that happens. Okay. And there are also industrial parks. He talks about a couple industrial parks that are built in this book. But by and large, those industrial parks don't have much in them because there's not other industry going on in Appalachia. You're not building anything out there. There aren't companies flooding in there because there's nothing there. So you can't fill the industrial park, even if you zone it that way, right? And so you reclaim it, and you're like, oh, we're going to build something. But the things they build tend to be, or at least tended to be, pretty lackluster in terms of like, oh, we've taken this mountain that was this beautiful ecosystem and blown it up in order to get the coal, and now we've put an empty industrial park here. It's God's green earth. There you go. It's like potato. No, right? It's not the same. It's not even kind of the same. One of the other things that Reece discusses in this book regarding reclamation is it's something that some companies will do or did do, is they would create a shell or holding company that a parent company would own, and that shell or holding company would own the mine or have the permit for the mine and be doing the mining. But then when they were done, in order to avoid the costs of reclamation, that smaller shell or holding company would declare bankruptcy and restructure itself, and the parent company would essentially absorb it. But because they declared bankruptcy, one of the things that federal regulations said is if they declared bankruptcy, the parent company or whoever takes on, whatever's left of this shell or holding company, the parent company is not responsible for reclamation costs, which means that there are a number, fairly large number, at least according to Reece, fairly large number of mine lands that essentially did not get reclaimed at all, right? Because the company that was mining there just declared bankruptcy and moved on. And the government did not at that time have enough money in its abandoned mine lands fund, because that exists, to reclaim all that territory. And so in 2006, they were only doing reclamation on mine lands which were a direct threat in some way to a nearby community, right? Which means there were a lot of mines that were simply just left unreclaimed, which is almost certainly bad, because think about the stuff flowing into watersheds from something like this if it remains like that instead of being reclaimed. Like, even grass planted on that would be hundreds of times better than just leaving it that way, right? So a lot of this book is focused on humans and the cost for human beings of strip mining, because it's not just the environment. Like, the guy who writes this, he's an environmentalist. He's like a pantheist, so he's like talking about nature as if it's like a being, as if it has the same moral worth as like people. And I don't go that far. But he also spends a lot of time talking about the people. And so just some of the things he details regarding the effects on communities that strip mining has. Number one, he does give some time to the arguments or the arguments you might make for strip mining, which is, number one, it is really good for some people, even local people, because strip mining is a source of employment, right? There are families in Appalachia who are like, yeah, my dad works at the mine, right? And that's a good thing, right? That's local employment. You can make a good wage. You are lighting up your community, literally, like you are powering your community with the coal that you help dig out of the ground. So there is a degree of pride in that, right? And while I think strip mining is bad, that's not entirely misplaced, right? To say, hey, I provide a meaningful service for my family and my neighbors. Yeah, you power their homes because of what you do for a living. That means something. That's important. And so, while Erik Reece doesn't really get into it, I do want to point out, like, that's a legitimate thing to say is, yeah, we should keep strip mining because it's what my daddy does for a living. Yeah, yeah. If we stop strip mining, your dad's unemployed. That's not the answer either, right? If all we do is stop strip mining. Obviously, if we stop and replace it with something, that's something else. But if we just stop wholesale, it's like, yeah, well, yeah, your dad's unemployed. Great. That's not the answer. And that is because the counties in Appalachia where this sort of thing are taking place are some of the poorest places in America. Reece says at one point in the book, I think it's 1 in 5 American children live in poverty. And I think that's still roughly the statistic today. In Appalachia, in some counties, that number rises to 1 in 2 kids lives in poverty. That means they're food insecure, housing insecure, probably not getting good access to education, don't have access to reliable or good health care. They're living in a third world country inside of a first world country. Strip mining, then, and industries like it, can be the difference in some families between their kids eating on a regular basis, living in a place that has heating and cooling, living in a place permanently or stably at all, um, being able to go to school. It's the difference between having power and not. It's the difference between putting your kid through college and not. It is the alternative to doing meth until you die in some places. that is not something that can be ignored, right? And Reece gestures at that in this book. He doesn't do a good job of really addressing it, but he gestures at that. I think given the opioid crisis that has sort of happened between 2006 and now, I think if he wrote this book now, he would definitely have to talk about it, and I think he would. He cares about that kind of thing. It's just that at the time, that was not really as big of a deal as it is now. But when driving a dump truck for the strip mine, or packing holes with explosives at the strip mine, or smoking meth until you die are the only two alternatives, and for some people, that's effectively what it would be, you work at the strip mine, you know? And anybody who wants to say, oh, well, I wouldn't work at a strip mine. Well, yeah, I can say that because I live in Lexington. And, somebody from New York could go, oh, well, I would never do that. Well, yeah, you live in a high rise apartment in New York. Of course you wouldn't, because your alternative isn't dying from drug overdose. So it's really important. And I don't want to sound like some crazy, out of touch person when I say that I think strip mining's bad. I think it's bad. People dying of poverty is also bad and might be worse, right? At scale, certainly, is worse. Okay. Um, so, for some communities, strip mines have been unequivocally a good thing for the people there, at least in the short term, right? Um, so, there's that. There's also, again, don't want to sound out of touch, there's also the fact, and Reece really doesn't get to this. He gestures at it, but he really doesn't talk about this. This is the problem. I can say I hate strip mines all I want, and I don't like them. Okay, at least the way that they're talked about in this book, which again is half of the discussion. But I can say I don't like them all I want. The problem is that our society runs on coal and other fossil fuels. And so, unless I, or us generally, unless we are willing to change wholesale, we have to reckon with the fact that when we're talking about the costs of how we get coal and who's responsible for blah, 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 well, you kind of have to look in the mirror and say, oh, it's me, or us broadly. Um, I'm the reason we're pulling coal out of the mountains in that way. I'm the reason that we're, drilling for oil in those places. Because my car runs on oil and my home is heated by energy that's created in part by burning coal. Unless I'm willing to say, all right, well, how am I going to change the way I live in order to deal with this? I'm complicit in it, and so is everybody else, right? So it's not as simple as saying, well, look at what those companies over there are doing. Well, those companies, coal companies, they are supplying a very real demand by American society, including a demand by many of the people who would say, it's really bad that you're doing that. Okay, sure. But also, why do you keep paying me millions of dollars to do it? So, very important, very valid points to be had that he really doesn't get to in this book, which is why it's not 5 stars, because I think he doesn't make those points and he really should have. Nevertheless, for communities that are experiencing strip mining or have, because again, it's not really going on in this way anymore, which I'll talk about in a second, um, you got high rates of cancer and other diseases like black lung. There's a woman that he interviews in this book, and she points to one of her neighbor's houses, and she says, everybody in that house, and she's talking about like 8 people, she says, everybody in that house died, a young person, of cancer. And she takes him to a cemetery, and she basically just walks down the rows and says, that person died of cancer, that person died of cancer, that person died of cancer, that person died of black lung, that person died of black lung, and just on and on and on, right? Um, yeah, it's undeniable that long-term exposure to either strip mining itself or the effects that it has on particularly water, but also just the environment generally. Coal dust is really bad for you. It can kill you, right? It's bad for you. It will cause problems for your children. Thank God that I don't have to consider what I would do when it comes to like bathing my kids. I don't question if the water coming out of my faucet upstairs is okay for me to bathe them. right? I don't have to ask that question. Nobody's strip mining around my house. Nowhere even close. There they are. Mudslides, contaminated water. Both those things, not all that uncommon. Appalachia, like 2 years ago, there were some seriously bad floods in Appalachia. And I remember reading that they were exacerbated in part by the fact that there were so many unreclaimed strip mines. And those places don't hold water in the way that, go figure, a 200-year-old broadleaf forest would do. The water in many places is so bad that it's undrinkable. You can't bathe your kids in it. You can't bathe yourself in it. The other thing is that strip mining is enormously destructive, yes, of the environment, but also of alternative economic possibilities. When you clear cut a forest, that precludes the possibility that you might sustainably log that forest, right? Logging is a big industry. People make their millions in logging. You can do logging sustainably. You can plant forests and then cut a third of them, right? And if you do that, you have a long-term renewable economic resource, and you have a way for local people, because anybody can be taught to use a chainsaw. I can use a chainsaw. Anybody can be taught to use a chainsaw, which means local employment for local people long term, right? Indefinitely, because it's a renewable economic resource. When you clear cut entire forests, there's no sustainable logging that can be done because there's no trees, right? And so no sustainable logging. Reece talks a lot about cabinet making in here. He must be really passionate about the idea of cabinet making. I don't know how many people cabinet making as an industry is going to employ in Eastern Kentucky, but he seems to think it's a lot, so I figured I'd give it a mention. But it's legitimate. Like you could sustainably log and then make wooden furniture or cabinets, and that would be better for your community than strip mining. So there's that. Um, and the other thing is that these communities are at the mercy of the mines. The mines and the companies that run them have millions of dollars. They've got legions of lawyers. Even if the mining company does something wrong, the chances that someone from a poor county in Appalachia is going to be able to fight and win a multi-billion-dollar company, next to nothing, right? And so they're at the mercy of whatever it is that the mining company is going to do, right? And Reece details a number of times in this book, and again, this is largely anecdotal, but there are enough that I think it's a trend, even if it's smaller than he wants you to think it is. He details many instances where, hey, you're breaking that regulation, and the company basically says, yeah, so what? They're not going to do anything to us. And if they do, they're going to fine us and we can pay that. And we can appeal the fine and get it cut in half or more. So, go tell them by all means. Right? Quite tellingly, at the end of this book, Reece goes and reports this strip mine. He says, hey, I think they're doing something they're not supposed to do. And he goes and he tours it and they take some samples from the groundwater. And then he doesn't tell you the result of that. And I think partly it's because the book probably went to press before he knew if anything had come of it, but also because I think he wanted you to realize, like, it actually doesn't matter if anything comes of this complaint because they're still strip mining and they're going to keep doing it for some period of time, right? And it won't matter if this one thing changes anything. Because, as one guy says near the end, he walks up to one of the people that works at this mine that he's just filed a complaint against, and he tries to make a joke where he says, oh, yeah, the bad news, they just discovered an endangered fern. And the guy goes, doesn't matter. We're almost done here anyway. He's like, yeah, damage is done. Doesn't matter. If they tell us that we have to stop mining, we're just going to stop mining anyway in a week. So, whatever. So, mines are really bad for the community that they are in. And there are a lot of them. Again, go to the Office of Surface Mining website and just find the map of mines in Kentucky. So what? This book was written in 2006. A lot of what's in it is dated. He offers some possibilities: cabinet making, sustainable logging. I think sustainable logging is actually a legitimate industry that you could have going in Eastern Kentucky. Again, I don't know, cabinet making, I don't know. He also mentions subsurface mining, like, digging tunnels. But then he doesn't talk about the fact that that is also very dangerous. Again, my great grandfather got black lung in a mine like that and had to stop working in a mine like that because a piece of shale fell off the wall and cut off his leg. So it's not as if subsurface mining is just all hunky dory. And again, that was in like the 30s. I'm sure it's better now, but not like harmless and not completely safe. So there's that. Um, Strip mining of this kind doesn't really happen in Kentucky anymore. Because there was a real push a number of years ago to get away from coal that doesn't burn cleanly. Kentucky coal, by and large, does not burn cleanly. Again, talk to my dad about this. That's why I know that. That's the kind of thing my dad knows. So thanks, Dad, if you listen to this. You're so smart, so much smarter than me, and you make me sound smart, which is great. So thanks for being a smart guy. Um, so this kind of strip mining doesn't happen in Appalachia anymore. Problem is, hasn't been replaced by something, right? There's not an industry there that's replaced it. It's just they're just still poor, right? Lack of opportunity over there. So a lot of the mining that happens in Kentucky now is underground, and it's also on the other end of the state. Again, thank you, Dad. The state is also reclaiming a lot of these strip mines through the Division of Abandoned Mine Lands, which is a part of the Kentucky Cabinet of the Environment and I think of Energy and the Environment. I don't recall exactly, but this kind of thing continues elsewhere. As I said, I think this is bad. I think this kind of resource extraction is unaccountably bad. Reece talks about the fact in this book, and I think this is actually a really apt comparison, that the Department of the Interior in the early 1900s basically just said, if you see a wolf, shoot it, because wolves are really destructive for livestock. They're dangerous. They even, have been known to attack people, so just shoot it, right? Um, Ultimately, that did not work because you killed off most of the wolves, but then the animals that they preyed upon, their populations exploded and started to destroy the ecosystem, right? The whitetail population in Kentucky, like, denuded entire mountains of green material, which was bad, which meant that you had to hunt them down. You had to figure out a way to introduce a predator that could prey on whitetail, which we still don't really have in Kentucky, other than like people with guns. We don't have wolves, right, anymore here. That was bad, right? I think strip mining is that, right? It is a single-minded pursuit of a laudable goal, protecting people from wolves, protecting livestock from wolves, powering people's homes, helping people in your community like pull themselves up out of poverty. Both those things are good, but they are done in such a way that they are short-sighted and ultimately destructive, even for the people that they're supposed to be helping, right? An explosion of the deer population is bad for people who raise livestock because deer and livestock eat most of the same things. So you can't win by killing all the wolves. And in the same way, it's great if you want to, build the wealth of a community by employing people at this mine. But the problem is when the mining is done and coal is a finite resource, the mine leaves. And all of a sudden your community is left without this economic boon. That's bad. The opportunity goes away. And ultimately you might get black lung or cancer, or your kids might bathe in water laced with cadmium, none of which is good. And so it's this is a reference. It's an Ouroboros. It's a snake that eats itself, right? It's not good. It doesn't actually solve the problem. It just makes it seem like it's going to solve the problem. Ultimately, what I think this points to is that you need an economy that is human-sized. This sort of thing, strip mining and things like it, are going to continue. We live in a world which is basically based on the consumption of fossil fuels. That's not likely to change in my lifetime. Lots of people are saying, oh, we're going to go to electric cars and all this other stuff. I'm skeptical of that happening at scale. Maybe it will. Maybe I'm wrong. But I'm skeptical of that happening at scale anytime in the near future, which means that we have to find a way to extract fossil fuels without also completely destroying environments, ecosystems, poor communities, species of birds and all kinds of other things. We can't just be like, yeah, well, that's just what it costs. Because if that's what it costs, then we're doing things wrong. Right? Like if what it costs for me to live in the kind of house I live in and drive the kind of car I drive and have the sort of life experience that I have, if the cost of that is poor people in Appalachia dying at the age of 30 from preventable diseases and pollution, then it's the wrong way to do business. It's the wrong way for me to live my life. And at scale, it's the wrong way for other people to live their lives. It's the wrong way for our society to be structured. And I don't even say that as like a let's just cut fossil fuels. Because again, I don't think we can. But there is more than one way to get at them. And I think if the costs of strip mining are anything like what they're detailed as in this book, this is the wrong way to do it. It's bad for the communities that it happens around. It's bad for the ecosystem. And ultimately, it's bad for us too. And I don't say this lightly. If we know that it's doing that sort of thing to our neighbors in Appalachia, and we're just sort of like, well, tough, that's destructive of your soul. To just be like, well, there's a person over there who is going to die at the age of 35, and their kids are going to get all sorts of neurological disorders from drinking water laced with bromine. But I have a car that I really like driving, and I'm probably going to get a sports car when I retire. That's destructive of your soul. That's bad for you, not just in a regular sense, but in a spiritual sense. That's bad for you. And again, I am a Christian, and so as a Christian, I can't just be like, well, it's cost of doing business. If that's the cost of doing business, the business has to change. God doesn't, in Scripture, make human beings the conquerors or dictators of creations. He makes them stewards. He gives them meaningful work to do on His behalf, not on ours. And that means you're holding it, creation, in trust for God until Christ comes again. And numerous times in the New Testament, Christ speaks to people, either in parables or straight up, and says, hey, you're like a servant, and the master's gone, but he's going to come back. And when he comes back, he's going to ask you what you were doing. And what you were doing is going to have a direct effect on what happens to you after. Most people will take that and be like, oh, well, sometimes people are wealthy and sometimes people aren't wealthy, and this is why. One of the things that is talking about, because often it's like, hey, there's a vineyard. It's the creation. It's the physical creation. And Jesus is saying, hey, God gave you that to steward well. Did you? Or did you burn it down and kill it and extract from it because you misunderstood the meaning of the word dominion? Here's a quote from J.R.R. Tolkien's Return of the King, where Gandalf is talking to Denethor, who's the steward of Gondor. Essentially, he sits on the throne while they're waiting for a king to come back, but they don't think the king's ever coming back. And so Denethor basically reaches a point where he says, I'm basically the king. Gondor's mine, and I can do what I want with it, right? It's mine and it belongs to no other, is what he says. And he's wrong, because at that moment, there is a legitimate heir to the throne who's alive and who is coming. If you're a Christian, that's you. You're sitting on the throne of the steward. And there is a legitimate heir to the throne who is alive and who is coming. And you can either sit on this throne and say, hey, I'm waiting for them. Hopefully I've done a good job. Or you can sit on the throne and say, this is mine and no others. Because the thing is, the king is returning, regardless of which way you go. Christ is going to decide. He's going to know. He's going to talk to you about it. And we as Christians need to take the created order very seriously, because Christ in the New Testament uses flowers and birds. When he's trying to explain to people how much he loves them, he says, hey, have you seen the flowers? You see how God clothes them in radiant beauty? How much must God care about clothing you? You see the birds and how they're able to find food in like the middle of a field? How much must God care about you? You know, God sees when sparrows die. How much must he know about you? God is caring about his creation. He is actively engaged in caring about his creation. And that's how we know that he loves us. But that means that we will also, as the stewards of creation, have to give an account. And this is not the account that I want to give. We have to choose to do things within limits. And it might be more difficult that way. It will be more difficult that way. I don't know that humans can destroy the earth, like literally destroy it, but we can hurt it. And if the scriptures tell us anything, it's that God will allow us to live with the consequences of our destructive behavior. And that should be a serious caution to us. So, Lost Mountain by Erik Reece, 4 out of 5 stars. Really good. Spent almost an hour talking about it, so it's really good. And it's a pretty quick read. Took me, I don't know, 3 hours to read, 4 hours to read, which is not very long. If you hadn't watched this video, you could already be a quarter of the way through it. If only you'd started. But I guess you can now, so go read it. Or something else.